Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultants channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. And today I want to present to you a fellow American who many of you out there have probably never even heard of. And as he himself would say, you should have, if you were paying attention. This man tried to save your life. Was he a great American? You're going to have to decide. Was he an American hero? You're going to have to decide. What I will say is that he was one of the most significant Americans that I'm aware of in our history. He was the right man at the right time. And also, he's one of the most enigmatic citizens. Very hard to figure out. Milton William Cooper, best known as Bill Cooper. Before I get started with this appreciation, I'm not quite going to call it a tribute, but I am definitely going to call it an appreciation. On the off chance that Annie or Dorothy or Allison are watching this video at any time in the future, I want to say I am so sorry for your loss. Yet I'm so grateful for our gain, both of which came to us through your husband and father, Bill Cooper. Let's get started. Now, folks, I've been trying to figure out how to present Bill Cooper to you for the longest time. This man did so much over, at least a 10-year period. It's hard to know where to begin exactly. So I'm going to start with where he kind of became known to the public. The year was 1991, and Bill Cooper published a book called Behold a Pale Horse. This book was part of the underground scene, and if you listen to the government, they would say that it was anti-government, pro-militia publication, conspiracy theories, UFOs, things like that. The book, I'm not going to say I'm the greatest fan of the book itself. The first part is autobiographical, where Cooper tells his history, or at least his version of his history, being in the Air Force and the Navy, the things that he did, the things that he saw. The one that stands out in most people's minds is when he was on a boat. He claims to have seen a UFO. I believe he thought it was about a mile wide. A UFO come out of the ocean and fly up into the clouds and then come back down into the ocean and back up to the sky repeatedly for about 10 minutes. The first time it happened, only he saw it, but after that, when he told others on the boat, he says they all saw it. Now, in addition to that, he talks a lot about the government in ways that really hadn't been talked about before at that time. Remember, this was before the internet. This is before you could just sit down at your computer or your phone and look up, government documents and declassified documents. And the trade-off there is that back then, the information available was either legitimate or it was deliberately disinformation or misinformation from the government. That's really all there was, because there was no need for anything else. There, 1 out of a million Americans actually research anything that they're told. So you had to go to the library. You had to, Freedom of Information Act requests. You had to do incredibly in-depth research. I mean, basically academic style research to learn any of the kind of things he was talking about. What he talked about was so unlike what we had heard before. And a lot of his book, Behold a Pale Horse, involved providing those documents. So in that book, you're going to see a lot of Xeroxes. Back then, they had photocopiers, Xeroxes of government documents, including those that are supposed to support his military service and such. Unfortunately, he also included the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, if you know anything about that, that is definitely the conspiracy world. That is a document that supposedly has, quote, the Jews explaining how they're going to take over the world. And it has been used by anti-Semites going all the way back through the 20th century as justification for anti-Semitism and persecuting the Jews. And it is most unfortunate that he included that in the book. I'll be honest with you folks, I don't quite know what his attitude was toward the Jews. However, having said that, I will say that as we progress through this, you're going to see that I do believe he did not have a very good grasp on Christianity. And I think that's one of the reasons why he didn't have a good grasp on what the Jews are all about. So I want to make it clear from the beginning, probably the main reason I want to call this an appreciation rather than a tribute is because of his inclusion of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his book, Behold a Pale Horse. I don't know, people have said the protocols were real, people have said the protocols were a fake, meant to frame the Jews, to portray them in a bad light. I have no idea what the reality is behind that. My gut feeling, based on what I've seen, is that they're fraudulent, if only because there is zero evidence that, quote, the Jews have a desire to take over the world. In my experience, the Jews just want to live their lives like everyone else. Now, there might be some very powerful people of Jewish descent who are participating in this attempt to take over the world that we're seeing today, but they ain't alone, friends. You've got Irish people, you've got German people, you've got Muslims, you've got people from all over the place who are taking part in this world takeover. It ain't just the Jews. So I'm not here to condone his inclusion of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his book. I am sorry that it was in his book. I honestly do not know why that's there. But as we proceed here, one thing you're going to find is that Bill Cooper was honest enough, he was intellectually honest enough to change his opinion on things as he learned more and got older. And I would at least like to think that that's probably what happened when it came to the protocols. I'm not going to talk a lot about Behold a Pale Horse. You can get it online for free. Go to the Internet Archive or just search on Behold a Pale Horse. You can look at it. You can get it in PDF form or whatever you want. But I wanted to point out that that was his first interaction, his first presentation of what he wanted to tell people to the public. Because of that, he was able to begin going out and addressing people in public. Now, in particular, early on, he was addressing people in the UFO community. And that's where this gets to be so difficult to tell you about Bill Cooper, because Bill Cooper, whether he wanted to be or not, ended up being a centerpiece surrounded by this universe of everything from true patriots who just love their family and their country and they want everyone to be happy and prosperous, all the way out to the most ridiculous lunatic fringe you can imagine, and everything in between. They were just circling all around him, orbiting like comets. They would come in and come really close to him every once in a while. And it wasn't so much him, it's just that all of those things, conspiracy theories and real conspiracies, all of these things are such a tremendous quagmire in our world today, and they have been for so long, that you can't really tell what is true and what is not true. But then again, that's actually the ultimate point I want to make with this entire video. So keep that in mind, okay? As he went around talking about UFOs, what he was telling people essentially was that the government had made a deal with aliens, and I'm not exactly sure what the aliens were going to do, if they were going to take us over, and these leaders were working with the aliens to help that happen, to save their own skins, or what have you. But he did believe that there were aliens from outer space visiting us with these UFOs, and that our government was working with them in some capacity. Now, here's the thing. He claims to have gotten all of this information that he had from when he was in the military. He claims that after he was in the Navy on the boats, he was part of naval intelligence, and he has a whole list of positions that he held with the military before he was honorably discharged. Now, critics of Bill Cooper point out that his military record, I think, says that he was like a staff sergeant or something, nothing more. But at the same time, if you look at who Bill Cooper was and what he did and what he said and the impact that he had, that's exactly what I would expect to see in his military record. Either because when you're dealing with, anything from special forces to intelligence operatives, you can't trust the documentation. You can't trust the documentation to begin with. It's the government, for heaven's sakes, but especially with someone like him. So frankly, I could care less that officially the documents say that he was only a staff sergeant or something like that. Was he really in naval intelligence? I don't know. But the things that he was telling people were so out of this world, literally, not just the UFOs, but what he was talking about. For example, one of the things he said was that John F. Kennedy, in the assassination in Dallas, he was actually killed by the Secret Service agent driving the car, who, common sense will tell you that is the least likely person to be wielding a weapon. He's driving the car. His hands are on the steering wheel. That doesn't make a lot of sense. He claims to have been able to back it up with a real version of the Zapruder film, which supposedly showed that the other assassins had shot but not killed Kennedy, and the death blow came from the driver of the car reaching back and dealing the final blow with what he claimed was some kind of alien technology. Now, before you hit the stop button and you stop listening to this video, I want to assure you that I'm going somewhere important with this, okay? If that is all I had heard about Bill Cooper, you would not hear me talking about him right now. I promise you that, okay? But there's something else going on here. To me, Bill Cooper went through three distinct periods that we could see. The first one would be his, from his birth all the way up until we really had heard of him when he published Behold a Pale Horse. And in that period, he acquired these ideas and beliefs that are definitely fringe and frankly kind of crazy, right? The second phase of his life was after he started his shortwave radio show, which we'll talk about in a moment, The Hour of the Time. Throughout the 1990s, he kind of matured and grew into his own. And there's reasons for that, I believe. And then the third phase is toward the end, when his frustration with Americans' apathy and his paranoia over the government being after him got the best of him, and he kind of went over the deep end in terms of paranoia. Where I have the appreciation for Bill Cooper is that center period, when he was early on doing the Hour of the Time broadcast. So keep in mind that even though his early interactions with people as a public speaker were based on truly fringe ideas, I mean, ideas that really you just can't support in any way, shape, or form. The driver of the car being the one who killed Kennedy, you can't support that. But here's what I'm thinking. From what I can tell, I think, and from what I know of the way that the government does in fact work, I think Bill Cooper was in fact probably exposed to so-called classified information that told him that the government had made deals with space aliens, that the government had told him that the driver of Kennedy's car killed him. I think in some capacity, if you remember in my last video, very long video, the timeline history of the United States, remember what happened back in the 1950s when the CIA and military intelligence and such, they started working on mind control programs. And these are right out in the open. No conspiracy theory there. They're well documented, declassified. You can look it up easily. Even Wikipedia admits that it existed. The government was treating human beings like lab rats, just like Dr. Joseph Mengele did under Nazi Germany. And they messed up a lot of people's minds in the process. Some people would claim that some of the assassins that you saw in the 60s and all the way up to Reagan's assassination might have been influenced by something of that nature. I don't know. But it was done a lot, and one of the reasons for it was to get people to go out there and tell a bunch of fairy tales that no one's going to believe. Because when you do that, you're discrediting the whole, people tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So when it comes to UFOs, if people are coming out and claiming that, space aliens, little gray aliens or reptiles have made deals with the government and they're going to take us over with the willing help of Henry Kissinger and all this. If that's what people are telling you out there, like a Bill Cooper, and he was a very good public speaker, very, very confident and assertive in what he said. If nothing else, you knew that he believed what he was telling you. Now, if you get people out there saying that kind of thing, then the people who hear that are either going to believe it and they're going to go off into la la land, into the fringe, conspiracy theories and such, or they're going to discredit the whole thing. And the whole idea of the government having some association with unidentified flying objects becomes anathema to them. And as we're going to see, that particular connection might actually be rather valid. So again, nobody really knows. Bill Cooper has a more poorly documented history than just about anyone except Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, Lee Harvey Oswald, they figured out more stuff about him than Bill Cooper. Nobody really knows who this guy was or where he came from. But when he hit the scene and he started talking at these UFO conferences and such, this is the kind of thing he was telling people. And even the UFO enthusiasts would sometimes start yelling at him and saying, this is crazy, this is absolute lunacy. But here's the thing, right about that time is when Cooper seemed to be shifting his gears. Even though he was talking about these topics, at the same time, he seemed to be changing his mind on the very topics he was talking about. It was almost as if, having been out of that environment where you're maybe being programmed by the government to say things, might have allowed his real intellect to take over and to start perceiving reality more correctly. One way you can tell this is because he was very adamant about telling people, do not believe anything that you hear, anything that you read. Do not even believe what I tell you until you yourself have gone out and researched and validated it and proven that what was said is true. And with that, I want to give you your first taste of how Bill Cooper spoke. Here is the end of his speech at a MUFON UFO conference. And just listen to what he said, because what he says here really sets the stage for where he was going to be headed in that phase 2 of his life, where he was really an extraordinarily important American.
I'm gone past my limit. I'm not going to infringe upon the other speakers. The text of my speech will be on sale outside. I only have one message to give you. I don't care what you think of me. I don't care what you call me. I do care what you do with this information because it is important to our survival as a species. It's important to our planet. It is important for the world. What happens to me is of no consequence, and I knew that when I started this. And over the last 17 years, I knew that someday I was going to have to get up and say this, whether I wanted to or not, whether I was afraid or not. Now I am here, and now it is done. And I feel an overwhelming relief. You now have the information. You can laugh at it. You can throw it in the trash can. You can burn my house down if you want to. But I am telling you right now, your future, your children's future, your grandchildren's future depends upon what you do with this information. Your own government is selling your children drugs, and you don't seem to care. Your own government has given away the power of the people, and you don't seem to care. There is an apathy that is running rampant in this country that is deadly, whether or not there are aliens. We are truly now, at this moment, a nation of sheep. And ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that sheep are always led to the slaughter. But it does not have to be that way. There is tremendous power in knowledge. There is also tremendous power in secrecy. Take away that secrecy, you make sure that you're informed, and you can change things and stop fighting with each other.
Now, before I continue talking about Bill Cooper, I need to address what he said at the end there about secrecy, which includes things like censorship, which is how you keep the truth a secret. We are experiencing a form of censorship in the United States of America today that has not been seen by Americans since they watched it happen in the Soviet Union. It is in many ways worse, especially when we have a First Amendment that protects that. Along those lines, before I continue with Bill Cooper, I want to play you a brief portion of a speech that John F. Kennedy made before he was assassinated, where he talks about the problem with censorship and government working in secret.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
I don't know if this is a sign or what, folks, but this, as I'm recording this, just happens to be the very time and now we have police cars. It's the very time of the month when the air raid siren, the tornado siren, is tested. I don't know if that's a sign or not, but let me tell you why it's interesting that that is happening right now. Because on January 4th of 1993, Bill Cooper started a shortwave broadcast called The Hour of the Time. Let me play the introduction to The Hour of the Time for you. Back in 1993, even before Bill Clinton was sworn into office as the President of the United States, people who were listening on shortwave radio heard that introduction pretty much every single day for the next 9 years or so. The Hour of the Time was Bill Cooper's way of branching out and getting away from the UFO topic and talking about the things that were truly important to Americans, both in terms of current events and his descriptions of ancient secret societies that are still operating and functioning in some capacity even today, which to him were behind this New World Order, or whatever you want to call it. The Illuminati, the people who want to have a one world government in the style of Nimrod at Babylon. Now remember, in the Bible, when after Noah's flood, when Noah's family began to replenish the earth, God told them to spread across the entire world and to exert their dominance over the world. He gave them the world. But instead what happened was they all congregated for safety and security. Don't want to get hurt. They all congregated in Babylon. And Nimrod said, well, let's build a tower up to the heavens. God had told them to do something else. He tore down the Tower of Babel, and he spread the people all across the world by changing and confounding their languages. That's how the biblical account goes for why we have the various languages today, and why those people were forced by their inability to communicate with each other to finally spread out around the world as God told them to do in the first place. This New World Order, or attempt once again at a world government, a totalitarian world government, is not something that God condones. It is something that God is very much against. God has always been in favor of different independent nations, for very good reason. So as Bill Cooper began the Hour of the Time broadcast, he went off in a whole bunch of different directions. And here's the thing. This is where he truly came into his own. On the one hand, remember, back then, no internet. No internet. Very difficult to research anything, especially when you're dealing with classified documents. And yet, Bill Cooper, he somehow managed to know the names of the people involved in this. And now, here, 30 years later, we can confirm that those names really were major players behind the scenes. These are not names that you would see in the newspapers or on television. But he knew their names. He would quote documents. He would refer to documents, both classified and declassified, which we now know existed. So how did he know that? You can argue with his interpretation of it all you want, but the fact is, without any particular ability to access that information in a pre-internet age, he knew the information, and he knew it well. He basically knew it by heart. It's like, I listened to one tribute, and I'm so sorry I don't remember the name of the person who did that tribute to Bill Cooper back in 2016, but as he pointed out, today a lecturer would go out with their laptop computer and all their notes and a PowerPoint presentation, and Bill Cooper just knew all this stuff off the top of his head. He knew the names, he knew the documents. He could do a pretty good job of quoting these things. Absolutely amazing. So he was clearly immersed in it. And when you think about that, there's only really two explanations for it. Either he did in fact have a background that put him at access to that kind of information, as he claimed he did, or he was some kind of a plant from the government, some kind of a disinformation agent himself. But the problem is, he did not in any way, shape, or form conduct himself like a plant would. And we have plenty of examples of these kinds of disinformation agents all around the world, especially in totalitarian societies. I'm going to talk about one of them whose name you have heard of in a little while. So, when Bill Cooper began the Hour of the Time broadcast, he started branching off into other topics. Over time, and I'm jumping ahead here a bit, but over time, what he said about UFOs completely changed. And I have to respect him for that. He came to the conclusion that most likely he himself had been misinformed by the government deliberately, that the government was trying to use him as a useful idiot. They show him these documents. They say that the driver of Kennedy's car shot him. They say that, government has made deals with aliens from outer space, and he's supposed to go out and tell people to create all kinds of division and portray anyone who's investigating the reality of the situation as a bunch of fringe lunatics. And Bill Cooper did not like being treated that way. So he really came out guns a-blazing with the Hour of the Time broadcast. To show you what I mean, I'm going to play an excerpt from the Hour of the Time, and I'm sorry I don't remember when this was. It was probably around the late 1990s. But listen to what he has to say about UFOs this time around, after he's had almost a decade away from government to try to figure out what's really going on. Now keep in mind, this is a lengthy clip. This is about 8 minutes long, and I actually trimmed it down from about 18 minutes. But I did not change the content of what he said at all. I just kind of took out some digressions to focus on what you need to hear. Remember, this is what Bill Cooper understood to be going on with the UFO phenomenon less than a decade after he published Behold a Pale Horse. He starts out by commenting on the idea that the world, and especially the United States people, would learn that the government itself was behind the UFO phenomenon.
Well, folks, if that ever happens, I want to see the day. Because if that happens, it will rip apart the veil of secrecy that they've had around this technology for the last 45 to 50 years. And nobody is going to allow that to happen, because that's their ace in the hole to bring about the New World Order, by presenting us with an artificial and completely false threat from some other species, from some other planet. And I think the only obstacle to that scenario right now is they have not been able to produce anything in a laboratory, as of yet, that looks like an extraterrestrial being and can think and speak and is convincing. But mark my words, they will. And when they do, none of us will be able to tell if that creature was manufactured in a laboratory or really did come from some distant star system. And that's the inherent danger in all of this. For you see, just the presence, just the reality, just convincing the people of the world that such a creature could exist and could travel from there to here constitutes a serious threat to our planet and to humanity. For if they are more technologically developed than we, and of course if they got here and found us first, they would be more technologically developed than we. It would mean that our governments would ask for great sacrifices of all of us, giving up our freedoms, giving up foods and supplies, in order to manufacture a tremendous space program, wasteful, gigantic in scope, to protect us from this external threat from outer space. And of course, since none of us would have any means at our disposal to verify the reality or the fantasy of this threat, we would have no choice but to comply. And the first realization of this massive, gigantic movement to protect the earth from this alien threat would be a one-world, totalitarian, socialist government. Mark my words, this is one
This is only one of the contingency plans of those who want to bring this about, and they have at their disposal the technology that has already been used for many, many years to implant in the subconscious mind of the men and women, the people of the world, that the threat is real, even though there is no proof anywhere existing upon the face of this earth or anywhere else that extraterrestrial beings exist, much less are visiting this earth. Now, in case you are wondering why I was devoting time to this subject, now you know. How you know? I found a speech given by John Dewey in 1917 to the visiting Japanese imperial delegation at a dinner in New York City, and John Dewey said this was the first words out of his mouth, quote, "Someone remarked that the best way to unite all the nations on this globe would be an attack from some other planet. In the face of such an alien enemy, people would respond with a sense of their unity of interest and purpose." Unquote. Remember, he said that in 1917, which means this was not a new plan. 1917, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you understand the significance of what I'm telling you. In the 1960s, a book surfaced called The Report from Iron Mountain. I'm now going to read you some of what was contained in that book. Some of the admissions in the Report from Iron Mountain are staggering. I quote from the report, "Credibility, in fact, lies at the heart of the problem of developing a political substitute for war. This is where the space race proposals, in many ways so well suited as economic substitutes for war, fall short. The most ambitious and unrealistic space project cannot of itself generate a believable external menace. It has been hotly argued that such a menace would offer the last best hope of peace, etc., by uniting mankind against the danger of destruction by creatures from other planets or from outer space. Experiments have been proposed to test the credibility of an out-of-our-world invasion threat. It is possible that a few of the more difficult to explain flying saucer incidents of recent years were in fact early experiments of this kind." Do you understand, folks, what I'm trying to get across to you? Now listen to this. If you wonder if there is no ozone layer, and if CFCs are not depleting the ozone layer, and if ozone is really caused by the interaction between ultraviolet light and oxygen molecules, then what is all this ozone stuff about? Well, listen to this. Also in the report for Iron Mountain, which was really entitled "The Probability and Possibility of Permanent Peace." Nevertheless, an effective political substitute for war would require alternate enemies, some of which might seem equally far-fetched in the context of the current war system. It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destruction by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. Poisoning of the air and of the principal sources of food and water supply is already well advanced, and at first glance would seem promising in this respect. It constitutes a threat that can be dealt with only through social organization and political centralized power. But from present indications, it will be a generation to a generation and a half before environmental pollution, however severe, will be sufficiently menacing on a global scale to offer a possible basis for a solution. Are you listening out there? You see, all of these are scams, contingencies, to create a cry for centralized control, a one-world government in the guise of permanent peace. Permanent peace is a noble goal. One world government that we're manipulated into with the protection of the rights of individuals, specifically in the United States of America, the protection of those God-given rights under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, is not a noble idea. for we do not know the structure of this new world government. We do not know their true intentions. We know that they state their benevolent intent, but if they are truly benevolent, why do not they include us in their decision-making? Why cannot we take a vote? Why aren't these problems presented to the human race as a whole so that we can all use our minds to come up with an answer? Why must the human race be enslaved in a one-world totalitarian socialist order that is coming?
In other words, folks, Cooper did not seem to want to disown the evidence of his own senses. He says he saw a huge UFO come out of the water, fly up into the clouds, and back down again repeatedly. Previously, he had been under the belief that this was really aliens from outer space who were working with the permission of our government, working in collusion with our government, based on what he had been told in, quote, intelligence circles. But by this time, based on new information and thinking a little more clear-headed about it for several years, he came to the conclusion that this technology was actually made by our government itself. And we all know that the technology our military has is many years, many decades in advance of what we have in the consumer world. So it doesn't have to be a spaceship that flies to Alpha Centauri. It just has to be a UFO that, even if it wobbles a bit, flies around this planet. That's all it has to do to serve the function that Bill Cooper was talking about here, which is to basically conduct a false flag operation claiming that we're being invaded by aliens from outer space, and the only way we can fight it is if we gather together in unity under a one-world government which has no choice but to be a totalitarian society to protect us all, to keep us all safe. And what he's talking about here is contingencies. Contingencies. Different possible routes that a group who was dead set on taking over the world being able to do so. For example, they could use the pollution problem. Now, I've said all along, it's one of my existential threats to America, I believe. Pollution. That's the problem. That's why people are getting so sick. That's the real threat to us. Now, the pollution issue never went anywhere. So what did they do? They came up with climate change instead. If given the way that our media lies to us completely in our face, you can watch the numbers in the election and watch what happens, and then the media tells us that the polar opposite happened, and places like Twitter and Facebook will censor you and shut down your account if you state what actually happened in the real world right in front of everyone's eyes. If you think it's impossible or implausible that that group of people could try to perpetrate an alien invasion to unify the world under one government, then you are not paying attention. Remember, this is one thing that Bill Cooper never talked about, but this is something I talk about often, which is anti-smoking, which was one of it was really the hate groups, 500-year-old hate groups who managed to take over government internally for the purposes of propagating their own hatred against smokers and tobacco companies. But in the process, they created a playbook for manipulating masses of people very quickly into believing the polar opposite of reality. And that playbook has been used by climate change people. It could easily be used by people who wanted to pull off a fake alien invasion. Because after all, if you're just going about your life, but maybe once in a great while you see a UFO fly overhead, but that's all you see. But then you turn on the TV and you watch CNN, and all of a sudden they're blowing up Paris and aliens on the ground, and you see troops fighting them and all that. Just, you don't have to see it right outside your door to believe that it's really happening somewhere else in the world, and to give up all your freedom for safety and security. Another contingency plan would be maybe a pandemic. some kind of a virus that might threaten the whole world. Think about that. Now take a look at the first 400 episodes of The Hour of the Time, just to get a feel for the kind of topics that Bill Cooper talked about on the show. I'm not going to go. One thing I do want to mention is that the archive for pretty much all of his show are available for free. You can download them online and listen to them. They're not the greatest quality in the world. Don't forget, they were shortwave to begin with, and then they're rendered down into MP3s. But you can listen to them. You can even go with this chart here on the Hour of the Time website and pick out a topic. But the ones I want to really talk about are where Bill Cooper became dangerous to the government. You see, among other things, now Cooper was doing a lot of things. He was publishing a newspaper called Veritas, which sounds a lot like the modern Project Veritas, doesn't it? He also had this organization called CAGI, which was the Citizens Agency for Joint Intelligence. He pitched that as being the world's largest civilian intelligence service. And basically what he was doing was kind of like Project Veritas in a way. He was having his listeners who had jobs in all these different fields, some of them in government, and basically blowing the whistle. They would tell what's happening. But more important, if there was a major event, an event that, let's say, wasn't quite covered properly by the news media, the people who were local to that event could go out there and document what's going on as an organized group, and they could provide that kind of intelligence on what had happened to Bill Cooper. And that's exactly what happened. It kind of started at Waco, with the Waco massacre, when the U.S. government slaughtered 76 men, women, and children, burned them alive after gassing them on international television, just a few years after we watched that poor guy with the suitcase standing in front of the tank at Tiananmen Square in communist China. But where this really came into its own was 2 years later, the Oklahoma City bombing. Because as it turns out, he had some pretty serious people who were part of this CAGI already there in Oklahoma City, and they were on the spot immediately. And that is one of the main reasons why we know so much about the lies that were told with the Oklahoma City bombing. There were people there from the very beginning. They were talking to the authorities. That's where they learned things such as, for some strange reason, all of the law enforcement, the ATF, the FBI, all of them were called and told not to come into work that morning. No one called the daycare center and said that those children couldn't come in for that day, but somebody told all the law enforcement, including the people who were responsible for the Waco massacre, who had moved to the Murrah building, told them not to come into work that day. You know, things like that. Things like how there were reports of government out with their bomb trucks looking for something in the early morning hours of the day of the Oklahoma City bombing. Also, things like where all the authorities at the site were saying two things in particular. First of all, that there were other bombs inside the building that had not gone off yet, and they had to disable those bombs and remove them. And that was reported in the media. I remember that as it happened live. For some reason, the media stopped reporting it very, very quickly. But early on, they had, quote, confirmed reports of additional explosives inside the building. The second thing that they pointed out was that emergency first responders were being told to leave the area because the government officials had said that before you're allowed to rescue people and to save lives, they have to remove documents from the building. It was more important to the government to remove documents. That was a federal building. It housed the ATF, the FBI, all the usual suspects. And can you guess what some of the papers were inside the Alfred P. Murrah building? For some reason, all the documents related to the Whitewater investigation of Hillary Clinton had been moved into the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. So rather than the first responders being allowed to do what they do, which is to save lives, including all those children in the daycare center, they were told to stand down because it was more important to remove documents from the building. It's people who were working with Bill Cooper through this CAGI, the Citizens Intelligence Agency, who first reported on that and documented it. And for that reason, I don't know when that was, it was a little after that, Rush Limbaugh supposedly read on his show a memo from the White House where Bill Clinton had stated that Bill Cooper was the most dangerous radio host in America. Folks, Bill Cooper was speaking on shortwave radio. How many of you have a shortwave radio at home? What could possibly make the man that dangerous when he can only speak to a tiny fraction of the adults in America? Unless maybe he was telling the truth, which would make him very dangerous indeed. As the horrific events of the Clinton administration progressed, everything from TWA 800 going down, JFK Jr.'s plane going down, the Columbine shootings, just so many horrible things happened in the 90s that really changed the character of this nation for the worse and did a lot to take away our freedoms, to put a muzzle and a leash on the Bill of Rights. Bill Cooper was there the whole time telling people what was going on. And that's what made him so amazing. He was just a guy who felt an obligation. He understood the importance of having a nation of people who were free. And the fact that they were free gave them not only the opportunity, but the moral obligation to keep their government in check, to watch their government like a hawk, so that they didn't do bad and nasty things like a totalitarian socialist regime would do. Bill Cooper was one of the few people at that time who was talking about these things. And that's what made him so important throughout the 90s. If he had not been there, there effectively would have been nobody talking about these things. Now keep in mind, I think it was back in 1978 when Art Bell started his radio show, Coast to Coast AM, and that was always a real fringe, lunatic fringe show. It still is. Not much good comes of that show at all. But that's all they really had, and that was on regular terrestrial radio. It was very, very popular. Every once in a while, they would point out something that was really going on in government, a real conspiracy, a real, nasty thing that the government was doing. But for the most part, as soon as they tell something about Iran-Contra that was real, then they'd start talking about alien abductions or Bigfoot or something. Well, that didn't give a lot of credibility to that. Bill Cooper tried to stop that. He tried to make sure that he was on point on every show. Now another thing he did, you probably noticed if you looked at the list of episodes on Hour of the Time, was he talked a lot about secret societies. Now where he got this information from, nobody knows. It appears that he just did a lot of research, but he also communicated with a lot of people. And as he took on this role as defender of the people, he's certainly going to be contacted by others and such to be given more information from, insider whistleblower type information. But he called this whole secret society, mystery religion aspect, he called it Mystery Babylon. Now, Mystery Babylon is from the Bible. It's from the book of Revelation. And here's the thing, and this is where I feel bad for Bill Cooper, because he did portray himself as a Christian. I believe he wanted to be a Christian. I believe he thought he was a Christian. But the simple fact is, he did not seem to understand the gospel, and he did not seem to have put as much effort into studying the Bible as he did into studying these things that were going on in the world. Mystery Babylon is a distinct entity. It's described precisely. Okay, it's surrounded by many waters. It's the trade center of the world, and it's going to be destroyed in 1 hour during the Great Tribulation, and the whole world is going to mourn. To me, no one knows what Mystery Babylon is. Personally, I think there's a very good chance that Mystery Babylon is the United States of America. But in any event, whatever it is, it's going to be destroyed in 1 hour. What Bill Cooper was talking about was a collection of secret societies that had operated for thousands of years, going back to, ancient Egyptian gods, Osiris and Isis, and the gods of Babylon, the Freemasons of today, the Illuminati, Bohemian Grove, the Skull and Bones, all these secret societies. Now, I don't think what he was saying about the secret societies was wrong. He seemed to be very knowledgeable on those topics. And I don't even think that if you can call it a moral background to it, I wouldn't call it moral, but if you look at the philosophical, religious background of these things, it is basically Luciferian in its foundation, which is exactly what you would expect. Again, according to the Bible with the book of Revelation, in the end times, this is Satan's time to shine. He's going to blow it. He's not going to be there long. Then he's going to the lake of fire. But he's going to wreak havoc on this world at the very end. But in order for that to happen, the foundation for that has to be established much, much, much earlier. If you're going to have individuals around the world who are meeting together in all these groups, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers, Council on Foreign Relations, and they're going to do it over several generations to plot and plan ways to reduce national sovereignty and create a one-world government, something has to tie them together. It isn't just about them wanting to take over the world, because don't forget, the early Rockefellers, they're dead. So it wasn't them becoming the leaders. Just like any other religion, like Islam or communism, a religion would say, we can wait, and we'll do our part now so that in the future this goal will be accomplished. And that's what Bill Cooper exposed, unlike anyone else had ever exposed. And he exposed that at its core, this was based on Luciferian principles. Was it flat out Satanism? I don't think anybody knows. Did it involve things like child sacrifice? Nobody really knows. But when you look at what's been going on with this group in the last several decades, specifically the child trafficking and the abortion, the sacrifice of 50 million children for some reason that nobody can articulate, you start to see a pattern of what's going on in this country. Bill Cooper was the only person I'm really aware of who was talking about that. And I should mention, I didn't encounter Bill Cooper until after he had died. It was, I don't know, it was maybe 2007 or 8 when I first heard of Bill Cooper. Which is strange, because I was into amateur radio back then. But, I had other things going on in the 90s. But the people who listened to Bill Cooper were learning these things, and whether they understood every word he was saying or not, the point is, He was exposing them to a different way of viewing what was happening in the world than they ever could conceivably have gotten from the mainstream news media. And that makes a difference. And what he did there was so incredibly significant, the value could never be overstated. Art Bell wasn't doing it. And I guess this is a good time to bring up Bill Cooper's rival, you might say. Now, Bill Cooper did a lot of interviews with the media when he was asked to, any opportunity to spread his message. One of the people who called him up was a guy running a little-known radio show in Austin, Texas, named Alex Jones. This was around 1998. Bill Cooper came on his show, talked about what he usually talks about. It was a pretty amicable discussion, and that was the end of that. A couple years later, do you remember the Y2K scare, where they said the computers wouldn't be able to roll over the year properly, so everything was going to fall apart and society would collapse, and we're back in the Stone Age, and nuclear power plants will melt down, planes fall from the sky, the banks will lose all your money? Well, nothing happened, of course. As people like me knew nothing would happen. If you understand computers, you would have known that. But if you're a businessman CEO who makes $10 million a year, you're not going to be smart enough to know that, are you? So you're going to spend a lot of your investors' money fixing this non-existent problem. And your investors are not very smart either, so they're never going to hold you accountable. It's just another one of those silly, pointless things that happens in a world of people who don't think very well. Well, when Y2K came around, the year 2000 on New Year's Eve, Alex Jones went on his show and he went berserk. He started telling people that nuclear power plants were shutting down all over the place. He said that the Russians were threatening to nuke the United States of America. They were getting their military ready, and they said if our power shuts down because of this Y2K, we're going to launch our missiles at America. He said there were tanks rolling through the streets of Austin, Texas. For about 3 hours, he painted a doomsday picture that had zero to do with reality. And he scared the crap out of a lot of people. A lot of people packed up their belongings and ran for the hills. Now, what happened after this? Now, Bill Cooper didn't know this because Alex Jones was just some putz down in Texas. But these CAGI members sent Bill Cooper the tapes of Alex Jones' show. And Bill Cooper played those tapes on his show, and he exposed Alex Jones. And he pointed out that what Jones did was so inconceivably irresponsible. He could have started a mass panic that could have gotten a lot of people killed, could have resulted in martial law to calm people down. And he speculated that maybe, possibly, that's exactly what somebody wanted to happen. And that kind of begs the question as to whose side is Alex Jones really on? Why would someone blatantly lie like that when there's no possible way you're going to get away with it? Now, according to the law of supply and demand, Alex Jones should have been working as a janitor the next week and never heard from again. But instead, what happened was Alex Jones somehow turned into this millionaire powerhouse who's still polluting our airwaves today. Now, granted, he's been suspended and kicked off of social media and such, but here's the thing. If you were a disinformation agent whose job it was to stand up literally in his case as a bullhorn in front of the people and just scream and shout about government corruption and all this so that the people would look at you as the leader and therefore look at you as the solution to the problem, and in the process those people who are following him do absolutely nothing themselves except watch his videos and buy his books and DVDs. Do you kind of see where I'm going with this? We need an explanation for how someone who did what Alex Jones did, instead of maybe being arrested for, inciting riots or something, or impeached, which is what they tried to do to Trump, isn't it? Instead of doing that, nobody said a word about Alex Jones doing that. And he ended up becoming rich and famous, traveling the world, and claiming to be the new Bill Cooper who was standing up for the people. Bill Cooper exposed him. And Alex Jones did what Alex Jones always does, and he immediately just lied. He came out and said, well, I had Bill Cooper on my show, and he wouldn't stop cussing. He was just so foul-mouthed, and I had to cut him off and end the show early. And of course, all you have to do is go online and listen to the show, and guess what? At the very end of the show, you hear a nice, friendly, well, thanks for being here, Bill. It was my pleasure, Alex. And they're done. Alex Jones just lied again. Remember, in any totalitarian society, one of the things that secret police do is they set up agitators. In fact, that's what Hitler was. Hitler was hired by the government to go and infiltrate the group that became the Nazi Party. He was supposed to go in there and see what they're up to, maybe stir up a hornet's nest, write down names so that the government knows who to arrest and throw into a prison camp. But instead, Hitler said, I can take these guys over and make them mine. But that happened in the Soviet Union. It happens in China today. They send in basically a spy out to any of these groups, and they write down the names and addresses and phone numbers of the people in the group. They write down what's happening, and they stir up a hornet's nest, and they usually do it by making wildly absurd claims that discredits the movement. And that's exactly what Alex Jones does. Alex Jones is still out there doing it, still making money. Bill Cooper is dead. But I'm not going to dwell on the duel between Bill Cooper and Alex Jones. That's something you should go look up yourself, because it'll help to explain a lot if you've ever wondered how and why does Alex Jones exist. The important thing I would point out is that Bill Cooper did not behave like Alex Jones. Yes, once in a while he got angry and he had a short temper, there's no doubt. And he would yell at a caller or something. But Bill Cooper was fundamentally different in his approach and in his goals to Alex Jones. Bill Cooper was always telling the people who listened to him to get out there and do something. He would never allow them to put him on a pedestal and make him do all the work. Every single show he pointed out, you have the responsibility to protect your family, to protect your freedom. It's not my job to do it for you. Which is the total opposite of Alex Jones, who just makes vague statements. Get out there and but he couldn't ever say specifically what it is you're supposed to do. Basically, listen to me. I'll take care of it for you. Of course, Alex Jones never did. One brief digression. One of the things where Alex Jones built a name for himself was he infiltrated Bohemian Grove. Bohemian Grove is one of those secret societies in Northern California, up there, I believe, in the Redwood Forests. A lot of people whose names you know, presidents, movers and shakers in the world, go to Bohemian Grove. He infiltrated it and he showed what they're doing up there. Guess what they're doing up there? They have a giant statue which looks a lot like Moloch, one of the ancient gods, the one that they would sacrifice children to. And they're all dressed in white robes, and they do supposedly a mock human sacrifice, with all the flames and everything. Yeah, those are your leaders, folks, if you weren't aware of that. Skull and Bones, those kind of people. Alex Jones infiltrated that and filmed it. You can see the film probably still on YouTube. Here's the question. If you have the people who have the most security in the world all gathered in one spot, and they're about to basically do a human sacrifice, what are the odds that anybody is going to move their way right across the river with a camera crew and film that and get away with it? Any ideas? Or does it seem more likely that maybe that was done with their approval? Because often they put these things right out in front of your faces because they know that the people are going to do nothing about it, especially if the people watching it don't do anything and they just sit back and expect Alex Jones to do it all for them. Bill Cooper was an entirely different person. He was probably more like the founding fathers than any American I can think of in the interim. With a few exceptions, high names, Abe Lincoln, Andrew Jackson, that kind of thing. But Bill Cooper took the Constitution very seriously. He understood why it existed, why it was so important, but he never stood up and said, I'll do everything for you. Listen to me, send me your money, I'll get rich, and I'll keep you appeased. I'll go out with the bullhorn. I'll never really get arrested or anything, even though if you did it, you would get arrested, but for some reason, I'm not going to get arrested when I do it. And if someone's putting on a legitimate protest over something that matters, I'm going to go out and just take it over. And instead of a nice legitimate protest, it's going to turn into this lunatic fringe fiasco because of my presence, and that's what your group will now be associated with, even though you never wanted me there in the first place. That's the way Alex Jones works. Bill Cooper didn't do that. In fact, Bill Cooper always said, listen to everyone, read everything, believe nothing, unless you can prove it in your own research. Bill Cooper said it over and over and over again. Do not even believe what I say. Research it, validate it, prove it. How many times on the Homeless Consultant channel have I talked about needing to validate what you hear in the media? I talk about it with anti-smoking all the time. People are out there just parroting what they've heard in the news media or at school about smoking and health, and they've never validated anything with that entire 500-year-old hate group. Doctors will tell you what's going to happen if you keep smoking. But if you ask that doctor, when's the last time you ever read and validated and confirmed even one scientific study on smoking and health? Any honest doctor will say, I've never done that in my life and I never will. Why would I waste my time with that? I'm just repeating to you what I've been told. Bill Cooper always said, listen to everyone, read everything, believe nothing unless you can prove it in your own research. And I certainly hope that on this channel I have followed in that tradition and never asked you to just believe me blindly. If I tell you something, go out and research it and validate it yourself. I could be wrong. I have been wrong. I have been wrong. I do everything I can to make sure that what I tell you here is correct, but I am not perfect. Nobody is. Now, another interesting thing about the Hour of the Time was Bill Cooper's obvious love and adoration for his family. He was married to Annie. Annie was Chinese. So you couldn't really accuse him of being a racist, which was a tough one because for some reason he kept being associated with militias. And he did have, a lot to do with militias, but not actively, just in supporting the concept of militias. But, militias in the 90s, that's supposed to be what led to the Oklahoma City bombing, according to the government's narrative. And militias were all these right-wing extremist, racist, nationalist, racist organizations. And here's Bill Cooper. He's married to a Chinese woman, and he loved her dearly. They had a daughter named Dorothy, just a little girl. I think she was born about the time he published Behold a Pale Horse. And one of the most charming things in that show was every once in a while he would have his daughter, and his nickname for her was Pooh. like Pooh Bear. Now, today, if he said that, it would be banned in China because they will not allow you in communist China, a totalitarian dictatorship. They will not allow you to mention Pooh Bear because he looks so much like their leader. And Pooh Bear's probably a lot smarter as well. Pooh was this adorable little girl, and I want you to hear for yourself what Bill Cooper would often have her do at the very beginning of the Hour of the Time.
You're listening to the Hour of the Time. I'm Pooh.
And I'm William Cooper.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was a great treat. It's been a while since you've done that, isn't it?
Yeah?
You see, what Bill Cooper was doing right in front of everyone's eyes was setting the example of teaching your children some kind of a moral and ethical code. He was teaching her to appreciate what the United States of America was, a free country. He was teaching her to love the United States of America. Meanwhile, people like Bill and Hillary Clinton were teaching American children to hate their country. Remember Hillary? It takes a village to raise a child, not parents. Of course, her idea of a village is a global totalitarian socialist government, isn't it? But again, part of the charm of the Hour of the Time was that it was clearly what amounts to a one-man show who was putting together this show inside his home with his family's approval, and he loved his family dearly. And it was wonderful when he would bring Pooh in to talk on the show. Now, he did have a support staff. He did have people who were helping him out, obviously. If nothing else, he had the Kaji all across the country. They were even set up into divisions, and they would have, division leaders. So they had a hierarchy. And that's what allowed them to transmit these whistleblower reports. And, if an event like a TWA 800 happened, what actually happened in that event from eyewitnesses would be transmitted to him pretty quickly. Meanwhile, the national news media is just racing over to the White House to hear what the government's telling them to tell the people. Oh, the empty fuel tank blew up. That's what happened. Oh, okay. We'll go tell the people that. The empty fuel tank exploded. Well, what about all those people who said they saw missiles heading up toward the plane before they saw a fireball and then it fell down to the sky? And some of those witnesses were military pilots and pilots in the air and very highly trained people. That didn't happen. Don't tell the people that. That never happened. Oh, okay. We won't tell the people. See, that's how the mainstream news media worked even back then, even in the 90s. How are you going to know the truth if the people you rely on you to provide your news lie? Bill Cooper would not allow that. It's not to say he couldn't make mistakes. It's not to say he couldn't get, either by design or by mistake, that he couldn't provide inaccurate information, but that's why he told you to verify it yourself. Because no matter how hard he tries, he could always make a mistake. He could always get duped by somebody. And he knew that, and he told you that. He was perfectly honest. He wasn't seeking to become a leader or a guru. And that's what I really like about Bill Cooper. He just wanted to do the best he could to be a responsible citizen and to help. And toward those ends, he did have some support staff. They would sell their tapes of their show, videotapes of his lectures. I think he lectured in all 50 states. And throughout the 90s, this is what happened, folks. People who were listening to shortwave were getting all this information from Bill Cooper. And yes, it wasn't that it was anti-government. He made it very clear that he was the biggest supporter of the American government as defined by the Constitution of the United States. It was anti whatever it is that was taking over the government. That's what he was against. And that's exactly what I'm against. That's what you should be against. But now it's too late. And with that in mind, let me tell you a few more things about Bill Cooper. He had a very he could have a short fuse quite often, and he particularly had a short fuse with stupid people. He did not suffer fools gladly, and frankly, I have great difficulty with that myself. I just don't want to deal with stupid people. I've got too short of a life and too much to do in that life to waste my time with stupid people. If he didn't coin the term sheeple, he certainly popularized it. He might be the one who actually came up with the term. But he would always talk about the sheeple, the people who just sat back and let their sheep herders, their shepherds, lead them wherever they need to go. And like he said in that one clip earlier, sheep are led to the slaughter. That's why they exist. They aren't there so your kids can pet them. They aren't there because they do something good for us. I mean, they give us wool and all that. But ultimately, the sheep get slaughtered. That's what they're for. And if the American people were not going to stand up for their rights, and if they were not going to put down their television set, put down, cell phones were starting to come out then, shut off the video game for a while, and actually take a look at the reality of the world they live in to defend and protect themselves and their families and their children and their grandchildren. If they're not willing to do that, they did not get Bill Cooper's respect. And they don't get mine either. They're just lazy bums. And Bill Cooper would call them sheeple. You would hear that a lot. In fact, here's a little bit on Bill Cooper's attitude toward sheeple.
Ah, yes. A nation or world of people who will not use their intelligence are no better than animals who do not have intelligence. Such people are stakes on the table and beasts of burden by choice and consent. Do you fit that description? I certainly hope not. If you do, then it's time to wake up and change it. And if you really want to know in a nutshell what's wrong with this country, go in your bathroom and look in the mirror.
Okay, now I apologize for kind of jumping back and forth with this, but like I said, there's so much that is associated with the 90s and with Bill Cooper and what he was doing that it's really hard to do it in a nice, straightforward timeline. But going back to the UFO situation here, he was one of the people who early on pointed out that he believed Stanton Friedman was a paid government disinformation agent. Stanton Friedman was that guy with the beard, very likable UFO researcher, if you can call it that. To me, just a goofball, just a very likable goofball. But, one of these people who are pursuing what they call disclosure. Cooper also believed that Whitley Strieber, the guy who said he was abducted, and Bud Hopkins, that they were CIA assets. He would always call Richard Hoagland Richard Hoaxland. And Richard Hoagland is not one of my favorite people either. I have rarely seen an individual who gets a public forum. Keep in mind, I live in a car, and I do all this for no money at all. I have to pay to do this. And I go to work at a job, and my reward is to sleep in a car. Richard Hoagland gets to go on Coast to Coast AM, and instead of talking about the reality of how the state of Minnesota profits by making people homeless and keeping them homeless, running a social service scam, instead of me being able to go and talk to George Noory about that, George Noory has this Richard Hoagland on there who just basically makes up science fiction fantasies out of his head. Something like L. Ron Hubbard would come up with. He just comes up with these ideas and he just talks about them, and he has no proof, no documentation, nothing to back it up, just these wild and crazy stories. And at best he'll say, well, this comes from a source who needs to remain anonymous because he's a former intelligence operative. This guy gets a forum to speak to the entire country, and I have to sit here and rot and die in a car. I'm no fan of Richard Hoagland for that reason. This guy is a complete waste of everyone's time. Bill Cooper called him out on that back in the 90s. Nobody listened. For some reason, Cooper also believed that Linda Moulton Howe was the real deal, and that she was sharp as a tack. Now, honestly, I'm not really here to talk about these people, Stanton Friedman, Whitley Strieber, Richard Hoagland, Linda Moulton Howe, but these people, to me, are complete and utter distractions from anything that is remotely important in the world we live in today. Whether they're intentional disinformation agents or they're just believing what they say, I don't know. I don't even care. But why people are worried about UFO disclosure instead of, I don't know, climate change being a junk science hoax or coronavirus health scare, why people care about UFO disclosure more than that, I can't quite figure out. Bill Cooper tried to focus on what was important. Now, let me talk a bit more about Cooper's Christianity. He talked about Jesus, he talked about being a Christian very adamantly, very sincerely. But the thing is, and I hate to say this, I really, truly hate to see this, and I'm not trying to say that I'm in a position to judge him or to know what was in his heart or anything of the kind, but I just don't feel like he understood the gospel very well. I don't feel that he understood biblical doctrine very well. And I don't think he understood, for all of his research into these secret societies that go way back that are part of end times prophecy, he didn't seem to understand end times prophecy in the Bible. And remember, his book, Behold a Pale Horse, that's named after one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation. Bill Cooper did not believe in the rapture, which is a pretty clearly defined doctrine in the Bible. In fact, it's really a necessity, as the church must be removed for God to go back to dealing with Israel for the last 7 years. That's a whole other story, but just that alone should have tipped him off to the fact that the rapture was in fact a long-standing doctrine of Christianity, back to the beginning. And I think one of the reasons for this is because he viewed everything through the eyes of these secret societies. I still wonder if when he was with the military, if they really did abuse him or use mind control or something. It was more than just the facts of what was going on. He seemed to take it personally. And what they were doing was much more akin to the way that, say, Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox, the Jesuits, Episcopalian Church, the televangelists, that his view of Christianity seemed to be a little more along those lines, which are basically apostates. They don't really have a lot to do with, the real full doctrine of Christianity. And so, even though he talked about Christianity a lot and about Jesus, very, very sadly, I don't think he understood what the Bible really said. And the sadness of that is that what he was describing that was going on in the world was exactly what the Bible had predicted would happen. And if he had known that, and if he had seen it, wow, I think he might not have felt so much pressure toward the end and kind of gone off the deep end. Because he just saw it as a battle between good and evil, and who knows when it's going to end. Good could win, evil could win. Whereas if you understand the Bible, God said, I declared the end from the beginning. I already told you what's going to happen, and everything he said's going to happen has happened so far. Why wouldn't it keep happening? In the end, God wins, Satan goes to hell. And when you look at the timeline, it isn't that far in the future. And if Bill Cooper had realized that, I think he would have been able to relax a lot more. This is one reason why when the United States of America was just taken over by a communist totalitarian regime just a few short weeks ago, it hurts. It hurts me bad to lose such a beautiful, wonderful country. But I'm not going to go berserk over it because I know how this ends. The people who did that, they're going to lose in the end, and they're going to lose in a very sad, eternal way. And if Bill Cooper had realized that, I think he would have been a lot more calm, a lot more willing to not be so aggressive against every single aspect of the government. Because of that, he didn't really show the fruit of the Spirit. So he would get very angry and he would call people names. You just didn't see that much love for his enemies. You know, as I said before, he talked about the secret societies and he talked about them as Luciferian, but he didn't seem to grasp the biblical concept of spiritual warfare. I mean, if you think about when Paul talks about the full armor of God when you're fighting spiritual warfare, that basically everything we're experiencing in this world is part of God's plan, which at least in part is meant to justify Satan and those who follow Satan going to hell for eternity. There will be nobody who can say that that is unfair or unjust when this is all done. And he didn't seem to grasp that. So when he talked about Luciferians, he was looking more at their rituals and what they do, sacrificing children, taking drugs, child trafficking, all these horrific things which are horrifying. But he wasn't seeing what the Bible says, which is that we do not fight against flesh and blood. We fight against powers and principalities of the air. In other words, Nancy Pelosi isn't the problem. It's the demonic influences on Nancy Pelosi that are the problem. And if somebody could free Nancy Pelosi from those demonic influences, even she could be saved. And she could become a truly wonderful sweetheart of a person. And Bill Cooper did not seem to grasp that. It was more of a good versus evil, and that's it. This person is evil. It's not that they're under the influence spiritually of demonic evil forces that we need to rescue them from by telling them the gospel. It was just they're evil. You know, George Soros is evil. Of course, Soros probably wasn't talked about them, but Kissinger and the Clintons and all these people are just evil. And it's a real shame that that's the attitude Bill seemed to have. And it wasn't a mean-spirited. I don't think he meant to be mean-spirited. I think he just did not understand the Bible. And he really should have spent as much time studying the Bible as he did studying what was going on in the world. Now, I could talk more about the Hour of the Time and what he covered in those. I would urge you to go to his archive online. I'll put a link in the description. Go to the archive, find a topic that interests you. I would recommend definitely the shows on the Waco siege and massacre and Oklahoma City bombing in particular. I remember those events. I was an adult. I remember them very, very well, and I'll talk about them some other time. But to hear at the time, especially from a guy who had basically intelligence operatives at the sites to provide information that the news media was censoring and making sure that the American people didn't hear, it's quite an eye-opener. And one of the things that's really interesting is how Bill Cooper was really the voice of reason, even more so than the mainstream media. After 9/11 happened, for example, he called for people to be calm. He didn't just come out and say, "I told you so, I told you so. See what they're doing? They're taking over. I told you." He didn't do that. He said, "Look, you need to remain calm. We need to gather information and determine what happened before we can comment on it. And we need you to stay calm and not go off the deep end. Let's get the information we need and find out what just happened at the World Trade Center." And he did much the same thing at Oklahoma City, except that he was getting a lot of information early on. One of the people in Oklahoma City he worked with was named Michelle Marie Moore, and I want to give her a special call out. Another wonderful American. And with Bill Cooper, they ended up writing a book. I think it's attributed to her. I'm not positive, but it's called Oklahoma City Day 1. You're not going to find that unless you find it on eBay or something at this point. But again, they were the first ones to point out almost immediately all the huge galaxy-sized holes in the government story that to this day have never been explained away. In fact, it's only gotten worse. So I would recommend listening to The Hour of the Time. A couple episodes, especially maybe the Waco and the Oklahoma City ones, but look for some other topics that you find interesting. And that leads me to just one other one I want to talk about. This was in June of 2001. Now, when George W. Bush took office in January of 2001, he did nothing. He was an absolute do-nothing president. He was just the frat boy, party boy, just having fun. I can't remember anything the guy actually did as president, which is interesting because on September 11th, all of a sudden this guy was able to kick into gear, even with a Patriot Act pre-packaged for him, as if they knew something was going to happen. But for 9 months previous, the guy did absolutely nothing. It was almost like he's just sitting around waiting for someone to tell him to start being president. In June of 2001, Bill Cooper, most people would phrase it as Bill Cooper predicted 9/11. That's not precisely what happened. I'm going to play for you what Bill Cooper actually said.
And now we're being bombarded with messages that Osama bin Laden is planning to attack the United States of America and Israel. And I'm telling you, be prepared for a major attack. But it won't be Osama bin Laden. It will be those behind the New World Order who once again want to take the guns and the freedom away from the American people, because we're the only ones left in the world who can oppose the destruction of freedom in the world and the implementation of a one-world totalitarian socialist government, and that is the goal. Now, how stupid can you be? Can you believe what you have been seeing on CNN today, ladies and gentlemen? Can you believe it? Supposedly, a CNN reporter found Osama bin Laden, took a television camera crew with him, went into Osama bin Laden's hideout, interviewed him and his top leadership, his top lieutenants and colonels and generals in their hideout. This is a CNN reporter with a camera crew. And he came out and told everybody, within 3 weeks, Osama bin Laden is going to attack the United States and Israel. Now, don't you think that's kind of strange, folks? You see, because the largest intelligence apparatus in the world, with the biggest budget in the history of the world, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years, and can't find him. The FBI also, under the leadership of Louis Freeh, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years and years and years and many years, and can't find him. Some doofus jerk-off reporter with a camera crew bosses right into his hideout and interviews him. And you know what his budget is? Zip, zilch, nothing. Now, that tells us two things. Either everyone in the intelligence community and all of the intelligence agencies of the United States government are blithering idiots and incompetent fools, including the entire apparatus of the FBI and all of their personnel, or they're lying to us. They're not looking for him at all. And the second is the truth. You see, the CIA created Osama bin Laden. They recruited him. They trained him. They found his leadership. They brought them all together. They showed them how to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and when that was over, they still continued to fund him and train him, and they're now using him to help bring about world government by making him the big boogeyman, because they can't use Saddam Hussein anymore. Did you ever hear of Osama bin Laden? before you heard of Saddam Hussein? When did you start hearing of Osama bin Laden? It was after Saddam Hussein and Iraq were supposedly neutralized in the Gulf War, because they needed a new boogeyman. And whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it. Another social illusion, social engineering project to change the minds and the attitudes and the beliefs of the people of the world, and especially the United States, to bring about one world socialist totalitarian government. When in hell are all you people going to wake up? Are you kidding me? I mean, is this some kind of incredible joke that people are so stupid they fall for this? Hitler could not have ever come to power, absolute power in Germany, without the Reichstag fire. Hitler was a socialist. He understood social illusion. He understood social engineering. He knew how to get the support of the German people, and he did it by burning down the Reichstag. The Reichstag was, well, in our country, it would be the Capitol building that contains the Senate and the House of Representatives. So if somebody were to go and burn down the Capitol building today, they would use that as an excuse, as Hitler did, to round up all of the enemies of the New World Order, which would be me and most of you listening, and throw us into prison or execute us, declare martial law, and come to absolute and total power in this country. I wonder what Osama bin Laden's targets are supposed to be. And if they don't, if this doesn't materialize in the next 2 or 3 weeks, it will eventually materialize, because they haven't succeeded in getting the guns out of the hands of the American people, nor have they succeeded in taking our freedoms away. In fact, there's been a great awakening in this country, and a big backlash against these Marxist, communist, puke-faced, lying, subversive, Nazi, jackbooted Gestapo thugs that is gaining momentum. And so I can tell you with a certainty, they must do something terrible in order to stop this backlash and regain the sympathy of the mass herds of sheeple out there.
Now, I wanted you to hear that preface from Bill Cooper where he talks about the way that CNN and the news media was able to just go interview bin Laden while the CIA is claiming they can't find the guy. The reason is because in my last video, The Timeline of American History, I used that, which was a very potent way of showing the absurdity and that something was dreadfully wrong there. But in the timeline, I did not attribute that to Bill Cooper, and I wanted to make sure I gave him credit. He's the one who brought it up in that way. But listen to what he said. He did not say on September 11th of this year, the World Trade Center will be attacked by hijacked planes and they will blame Osama bin Laden. He did not say that. He said that something big is going to happen. And I can't remember where, but he had mentioned the World Trade Center was a very likely candidate because it had already been attacked unsuccessfully in 1993. And he said, when this big attack happens, they're going to blame Osama bin Laden. But don't you believe it? And of course, after 9/11 happened, bin Laden said, I had nothing to do with it. And this is a guy who would gladly take credit for something like that if he had done it. It would have been a badge of honor for him. And yet he came out and said, I didn't do this. And then all of a sudden some guy who kind of sort of looked like a Halloween costume version of bin Laden started putting out videos saying that he did it. But right after 9/11, the real bin Laden said, I had nothing to do with this. That was in June of 2001. July, August, September. 3 months later, the World Trade Center was attacked. And as I said before, one of the few voices of reason out there at that time was Bill Cooper. You might listen to his 9/11 broadcasts. Listen to how committed he was to figuring out what really happened before he just came out and blanketly said, "I told you so, I told you so." Now, by this time, for the last couple years before that, back around 1999, Bill Cooper had actually sent his wife, Annie, and their children away for their own safety. Probably sent them overseas. Don't know. Nobody knows. But he sent his family away to protect them. And the reason is because he had been in trouble. He had been on the IRS's list for a long, long time. So they tried to serve him warrants on several occasions, and he was able to dodge it. After 9/11, 2 months later, all of a sudden the government decides, okay, well, now we're going to go after him. Now, he had been getting more and more paranoid. He had been getting more and more angry, possibly because his family was gone, and the man loved his family. But over the last couple of years, the last few years of Hour of the Time, he was really kind of losing it. And you could tell that he was just starting to lose. I don't know if he was losing hope or what, but he just was feeling all the pressure. He knew the government was going to take him out one way or another. He had been a thorn in their side for too long. He was fighting the IRS. You're the guy with the briefcase in Tiananmen Square standing in front of a tank, and those tanks will kill you. 2 months after 9/11, Bill Cooper was at home and he heard some people partying about a block down from his house. And one thing I should mention, I didn't mention before, is that Bill Cooper only had one leg. He had a prosthetic. So he could walk, but he only had one leg. He claims that when he started telling his secrets about the government, that the government ran him off the road, not once, but twice, trying to kill him, like rolling his car down a hill and everything. The second time he lost his leg. There's no way to confirm that one way or the other, but that was his claim. And that's back in the, presumably the mid to 80s, mid to late 80s. So Bill Cooper gets in his truck, because he can't really just walk all the way down there. He gets in his truck, he drives down to where these sheriff's deputies are pretending to be partiers outside their pickup trucks making a ruckus. And he tells them to shut up and basically get off his land. They weren't quite on his land, but they were too close for comfort. Well, somehow they identified themselves, and Bill Cooper pulled out a gun and headed back into his truck, and I can't remember if he fired there, but he started a fight. He drove up to his house, the deputies followed. Bill Cooper, when he got out of his truck, he started limping, I guess you'd say, to his front door. He fired, and he shot one of the sheriff's deputies in the head. And the sheriff's deputies shot Bill Cooper dead on his front doorstep. Bill Cooper was killed by the United States government as they tried to serve a warrant for an agency that he had taken to court, asking them to prove that they had any authority over him, and they could not do it. So it depends how you look at this. Bill Cooper, when you shoot at a sheriff's deputy, you have to expect to get shot back. But at the same time, those deputies never should have been there in the first place. So it's up to you if you want to say that Bill Cooper was responsible for his own death or that he was murdered. To me, it just shows how complicated the mess we're in really is. But that's where the sheep will come in, folks. And that's why the totalitarians win through violence. I don't really have an opinion on whether Bill Cooper died through his own actions or if he was murdered. It's just too complicated. All I know is that it shouldn't have happened, and he should be alive and with his family today. The free country that Bill Cooper sought to preserve, the one that he inherited from his ancestors and he worked so hard to preserve, that free country never should have allowed him to die in that manner. Ultimately, Bill Cooper's death became just another nail in the coffin of the U.S. Constitution and American freedom. He tried his best. He gave it everything he had. He put in more effort than somebody who's training for the Olympics. He gave up everything, including his family and his life, so that you and your family could be free and truly safe and secure, instead of being terrorized by your own government and tyrannized by your own government. But that's what happened to William Bill Cooper. In the final analysis, Bill Cooper was an integral part of several subcultures that flourished in the 1990s. The UFO movement, especially these people calling for disclosure. And I don't want to get too much into that, but disclosure is just baloney. It's baloney. It doesn't matter. They could disclose anything they want, but we have a government that lies. Their disclosure could be a lie. So why are we seeking that? He was part of the subculture of government conspiracies, both real and not so real. Remember the part about Kennedy's driver killing Kennedy? Why did he believe that? We'll never know. Again, I personally think he was probably, shall we say, experimented on by the government when he was in the military. Because once he got away from the military, he started to clarify his thoughts and to get his own independent thought back. And by the time he was doing all this stuff publicly, he was leaving that behind, those beliefs about aliens making a deal with the U.S. government and such. He seemed to have gotten his, the good of thought back. His personality could not always be pleasant. People who talked to him personally said he was just a really nice, down-to-earth guy. If you sat down and chatted with him, he didn't sit there and talk about the government all the time. He talked about his family. Just a real guy. A lot of people accuse him of being an alcoholic. Who knows? He claims that, he was kind of a heavy drinker when he was younger, but he really didn't drink at all by the time he was doing the show and he was famous. It's hard to know. The only thing you know is that his focus through all of this was freedom for mankind, and specifically freedom to give human beings a purpose to their existence. Because if you don't have freedom, you have a purposeless existence. You're just sheep to the slaughter. Or, as Bill Cooper would put it, steaks on the table. And because of this, Bill Cooper's focus could be described as fighting vehemently against any attack on freedom, any kind of activity at all that would deprive human beings of purposeful existence. And remember, he recognized what the American founders did, which is that the rights that are in the Bill of Rights are not granted by the government. They're stated, but like the Declaration of Independence says, those are inherent rights granted to us by our Creator. They are endowed by our Creator. The fact that we exist gives us the right to speak our mind with nobody censoring it. And just as I can speak my mind, so can you. But once one person says, well, I can speak my mind, but you can't speak yours because whatever reason they fill in the blank with doesn't matter. At that point, one of those people has become a tyrant. They have become the enemy of humanity. They have become the enemy of human purpose. Bill Cooper fought with everything he had against that on behalf of all of us. The man changed his opinions as he gathered more information. He refused to allow people to turn him into a guru in the sense of, let's let Bill Cooper do all the work like the Alex Jones followers do. the thing is, his immersion in this corrupt and polluted environment of our government, especially this horrific government we had in the 90s, which is the only thing that compares to that is what we're just starting to experience now, which is going to be infinitely worse. The pressure of that just drove him over the edge because he wasn't getting anywhere fighting the battle because nobody else did anything. He was the only one doing it. And I honestly believe that's one of the reasons that he didn't understand Christianity properly. I think he had to do all the work with these worldly stuff, and it took time away from him. I think he would have sincerely studied Christianity and end times prophecy, and he might have been able to make the connection for what was going on in the world versus what the Bible had prophesied would happen about now. And it's a crying shame that he didn't seem to have had time to make that connection before he died. To me, the best way to understand why Bill Cooper was a great American is to look at what he did not do. Bill Cooper did not waste the only life he will ever live vegetating in front of a television set. He didn't sit there and stare at a phone all day long. And he didn't sit on a computer playing video games or surfing the internet. He didn't do that. He did not accept what the news media or the government told him at face value without proof. He demanded proof. He did not listen to what scientists told him. He demanded proof. He did not listen to what doctors told him. He demanded proof. In other words, he refused to enter their cult mentalities, to where the media is just something you can rely on. The government, something you can rely on. Doctors, something you can rely on. Academia, you can just rely on them. Just because they're academia, they would never lie. No. Bill Cooper did not accept that. Bill Cooper did not resist valid evidence which opposed his own personal viewpoints. If you provided valid evidence, he would listen to it and consider it and possibly change his own point of view. Very impressive. He did not blindly accept the government's explanation for major events like Ruby Ridge, Waco, Oklahoma City, etc., etc. Anyone who accepts the government's explanation for those kinds of events, the Warren Commission report, you people get what you deserve. The problem is the rest of us get what you deserve. Bill Cooper did not do that. Bill Cooper did not allow utterly unbelievable and ludicrous events to happen without the government being scrutinized in every way possible. You couldn't have stupid things like this kind of a corrupt election like we just had without Bill Cooper analyzing every detail of it. He would never sit there and just accept it when it defies the laws of mathematics, the laws of statistics and probability. When you start violating natural law, Bill Cooper would never have accepted it. He would never have accepted the banana republic of America that we have today. Bill Cooper did not cower down to the unilateral dictates of government that are enforced by violence. He did not cower. He was not a coward. He didn't run away in fear when the government came up and said, well, if all else fails, we're just going to come at you with a loaded gun and shoot you dead. Which is what ultimately the IRS did. Of course, it wasn't the IRS. They made sure that there was some buffer in between these poor sheriff's deputies who had to go in and do the work, while the people at the IRS who were ultimately responsible for it just go on living their lives. Their neighbors never even know that they just took part in the murder of a human being. But that's the IRS. That's the Department of Education. That's these organizations you don't know anything about. Bill Cooper did not suffer fools gladly. Can you imagine Bill Cooper being around today with this woke culture? His head would explode. And believe me, I've never felt more like Bill Cooper than when I look at this insanity we have today. Bill Cooper did not live his life in fear of what would happen to him for being a responsible citizen and seeking the truth. He didn't want to lose his family. He didn't want to leave his family. but he had to do what he had to do to make sure that his children would grow up in a free world if he had anything to say about it. Very few Americans have the character to do that. And he did not put his own life above more important things. Again, you can argue that it was his fault because he shot at the deputy. I don't think he should have done that. I would never shoot at a deputy. But, he was willing to lose his life for higher principles, one way or another. So, again, to me, Bill Cooper was more like the American founders than any other citizen I can think of in American history, really. I just can't think of another one. All the American founders were very different. It's not like they all thought the same and believed the same, but they had a certain commitment to higher principles that were going to make the lives of future generations so very, very much better. And that's just something we don't see today. Personally, I'm grateful that he did not live to see the final overthrow of the American government. He devoted the latter part of his life to preventing that from happening. And if he knew that if his family is indeed in the United States today, if he knew that his family was now beginning to live under this totalitarian socialist regime that is working hand in hand with communist China, I mean, that's the definition of heartbreak. I really mourn for his wife Annie and his daughters. They lost their husband and their father, and as far as I know, they did live long enough to this day to witness the total and irreversible takeover of the United States of America, because the current generation was a bunch of lazy sheeple, and they didn't care enough about their own children to demand justice. Bill Cooper's life was literally like a war zone. And yet, 20 years later after his death, long after the smoke has finally cleared from everything that he was involved in, one thing is pretty obvious. In the big picture of things, Bill Cooper was absolutely right. And again, I only wish he had been as correct about his Christian faith. Because in the end, the tale of Bill Cooper shows us how absurd and convoluted the world we live in really is. I mean, it shows us how truth itself is the greatest casualty in the kind of political stupidity that we have in this world. It shows us how this world itself ultimately does not matter. We're just passing through this world. We're just here for a while. And the people who take it so seriously that they want to implement climate change regulations and take over the world and act like Dr. Evil, I feel so bad for those people. The only thing that matters is our status in eternity, because that's where we're going to spend eternity. Remember, this is just a little blink of an eye here, our lives in this world. But the only way you can concern yourself with your status in eternity is if it comes from the knowledge of the gospel of Christ. God, the Creator, who became a man and walked among us for the purpose of reconciling sinful and stupid human beings to His holy self, so that we could enjoy what He intended for us all along, which is paradise for eternity. That's what we need to focus on. And to impress this point, I want you to consider that what Bill Cooper did with his entire life, consider all the things I told you about he did. Cadgy, Hour of the Time, Behold a Pale Horse, all the speeches he gave, all the phone calls he took, all the things he did with his entire life. Now, on top of that, add in all these radio shows like Coast to Coast AM, where they talk about all this drivel nonsense, all the way back to when it was founded by Art Bell, and even today with George Norrie. Add on top of that, add in all the UFO experts, Stanton Friedman, Whitley Strieber, add in people like Linda Moulton Howe with the cattle mutilations and all that. Now, on top of all that, add in TV shows like In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy and Ancient Aliens with, that guy with the crazy hair who's a celebrity for apparently no other reason than because he has crazy hair. On top of all that, add in tens of thousands of books and TV shows and news reports and UFOs. Add in all the talk you've ever heard in your life about Area 51, including that Hollywood film Independence Day. On top of all of that, add in billions of dollars that have been spent worldwide on UFO conferences. The hotels, the conference hall rentals, the car rentals, the flights, the merchandise and book sales at the tables. Add in all of that on top of everything I just talked about. And then add in all the people who follow conspiracy gurus like Alex Jones and David Icke. You know David Icke? He's that guy who claims that many of our world leaders aren't actually human beings. They're actually reptilian entities. This guy has a huge following. People send him money so that he can survive, while I talk to you here living in a car and nobody sends me a dime. Add all that together, all of that together. Heck, go further. Add in all the pilgrimages, all the people traveling to Roswell, New Mexico, people traveling to Area 51, all these people who stayed at the Little Ailey Inn. Maybe they even conceived children there. Okay? Take all of that. Consider everything I just told you. This is huge. Just the amount of activity and money and buzz and this and that going on. All of that combined. And for all of that, right now, we still don't have the foggiest frickin' idea what is going on with UFOs or our government. In fact, for all of that, we still don't know for certain whether flying saucers even exist. For all of that, for all that effort over all those years and decades, we don't know anything. It seems like maybe all of that was kind of a waste of time, doesn't it? Maybe what we should be looking at is something that is not a waste of time. Our eternal destination. Are we going to paradise or are we going to hell? Maybe that should be the focus of our time here. President Biden is in charge of the Banana Republic of America. The country that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson founded is gone. It's irreversible. It is finished. It is over. But does that have to be the end of our lives? Because it doesn't matter ultimately. It's the blink of an eye. Biden can sign as many executive orders as he wants. He can pretend that he's a god all he wants. He's going to have an entire eternity to realize that he's not a god. And if somebody doesn't help to save that man, and we should pray for him, he's going to find out the hard way. Now, the reason I mention all this is the last thing I want to present you in this video today. For all that effort, all those things I just told you about, which have so far just amounted to absolutely nothing. We have no idea what's going on with UFOs. Now, let me contrast that with just one simple thing. Back in 1992, there was a small group of Christians. One of them played guitar. Another one played bass guitar. Another one played drums. One of them sang. One of them played keyboards. These kids were in their early 20s, and they wrote a song called Waiting for the Aliens. And you know what, folks? I'm going to play that song for you now with the lyrics, and I want you to realize something. That little group of 20-something musicians who weren't paying attention to any of this other stuff out there, they give us the single most plausible explanation for UFOs that I have ever heard. It's the only one that makes any sense at all. And they got that information from just one source. They read and they studied the Holy Bible. Because the Bible tells you what this is all about. And that's something to think about. maybe, just maybe, the answers to our most important questions have already been answered by God. Maybe He's been pleading with us for 6,000 years to just pay attention. The same thing Bill Cooper was telling us to do. Pay attention. But the question is, what are you paying attention to? And that's the question I'll leave you with, folks. Thank you so much for listening to this appreciation of Bill Cooper. Here is that song by the band called Barnabas. The song is called Waiting for the Aliens.
Say that it's a message from space. well as any liaison with unlawful religious gangs operating throughout the globe, will be terminated swiftly and without mercy.